Chapter 4. On Sunday morning, when Paul woke up, it was still there. Pity, he thought. He'd divided the previous night between tidying up the mess, his own as well as the intruders. There was now so little space left in his cramped bedsit, thanks to the thing, that he couldn't afford the luxury, and staring at it, wondering what the hell it meant and what he was supposed to do about it. He'd fallen asleep looking at it. Now, as he opened his eyes and saw the silhouette of the hilt against the drawn, glowing curtains, he felt more irritation than wonder or fear. Bloody thing, he thought. Bulky and sharp, too, as a plaster on his right forefinger testified. Far too heavy for him to move on his own. How had they got it up the stairs, for crying out loud? Something that size, you'd need a forklift, scaffolding, winches, and place exactly where it would cause the maximum disruption and inconvenience. He swung his legs off the bed and stood up, wondering whether a night's sleep had produced anything resembling a rational explanation. Unfortunately not. Not a practical joke by his friends. Not a rare species of fungus that just happened to look like a sword in masonry. Not even an unwanted free gift from the book club. It hadn't dropped off a passing airliner because there wasn't a corresponding hole in the roof. He got dressed, gave it one last long stare, and crossed the landing. First, he tried the guitarist next door. Then he climbed the stairs and asked the two nurses in the top flat. All of them were unhappy at being disturbed at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, and none of them had been expecting a delivery that might have been left at his place by mistake. Paul went back to his own room, and it was still there. Bloody persistent thing. He draped a shirt over the sword's handle and put the kettle on. His duty as a citizen was to call the police, but he wasn't really minded to do that. Possibly he might have done if he hadn't spent the previous evening being shoved around like a cue ball by Gilbert and Sullivan. But it was all too easy to imagine the line of questions that would lead to embarrassing disclosures, followed by an uncharitable assessment of his sanity. Also, for all he knew, they'd arrest him for possessing an offensive weapon. Well, it was offensive, all right. It didn't have eyes, but there were a couple of rivets on the hilt that seemed to follow him all around the room. He'd felt uncomfortable putting on his pyjamas with the bloody thing watching him. The shirt helped, so he added a couple of pullovers and an old tired woolen scarf. Now at least it looked like a cross between a scarecrow and a charity shop tailor's dummy, except for the 15 inches of cold bright steel poking out from under the tail of the shirt. Paul made his cup of tea and perched on the edge of the bed, frowning. Then, probably because he was looking at it from a different angle, he saw the lettering on the stone. He nearly spilled his tea. Here was something to go on, at least assuming he could read what it said. The letters were very small, front and back, and he had to kneel down and squint before he could read them. "Whoso draweth this sword from the stone shall be rightful king of all England." And in smaller letters still, under that, "Please dispose of stone tidily after use." Well, that torpedoed the stolen war memorial theory. It also rang a bell. A Disney film, or some story he'd read in his book of faraway tales when he was a kid. King Arthur, Excalibur. He wished he hadn't seen the letters after all. He tried to look on the bright side. There had to be loads of people who made stuff like this, ornaments and gift ideas for the man who had everything. Executive toys where Newton's cradle and the little chrome weather vane thing just didn't cut it anymore. Had there been any big-budget fantasy films lately? Usually the promotional junk you saw standing in the Odeon foyer was cardboard and styrofoam rather than tempered steel and granite, but perhaps some marketing wizard had decided that it was time for a whole new attitude to pre-launch hype. Yes, but why here in his room? Unless they were delivering one to every single household in the country, and even the Harry Potter people wouldn't go that far, or would they? It simply didn't add up. He clawed at his scalp until it hurt. This was silly. And then he thought, well, why not? After all, it was here, it was real, and if it actually worked, he could quite fancy that even if it did mean putting up with the paparazzi and the corgis, not that it would, of course, but if it did, Paul pulled off the shirt, the sweater and the scarf, braced his feet wide, gripped the hilt in both hands and heaved. At least he had the sense to pack it in before he pulled a muscle or cut himself on the sharp edge. It wasn't going to budge. No reason why it should, since it was clearly in there pretty solid. There didn't appear to be a hidden catch or anything like that, and this was probably a case where even WD-40 wasn't going to be much help. He gave up, put back the claws and went back to the cupboard for a can of baked beans. It was at this point that he noticed the missing tin opener. He was hungry, and the only food in the place was in tins, as comprehensively armoured and inaccessible as a medieval knight. True, the last time he'd ventured out of doors in search of nourishment, strange things had happened to him. But being in a confined space with an overgrown letter opener gave him a pain. He counted his money, including the change in his trouser pocket and the small stash of copper in the jam jar on the mantelpiece, but deducting bus fares until payday, it came to just about enough for a small sliced loaf. He locked the front door behind him, though there didn't seem much point. There was nothing left to steal apart from the sword, and anybody who wanted that could have it and welcome. Instinctively, he headed for the shop on the corner, only remembering as he stood outside that it had been shut yesterday afternoon. But it was open for business, and Mr. Singh was outside, manhandling bales of Sunday newspapers. They exchanged formal greetings, and Paul bought a loaf. "By the way," he asked, "I hope everything's all right. Family well and everything?" "Fine," Mr. Singh replied. "Thank you for asking." "That's okay. I just wondered, with you being shut yesterday." Mr. Singh nodded and explained that he had arranged to visit his married sister in Droitwich, and his cousin, who'd been going to mind the store for him, had got held up at the last moment. He apologised for the inconvenience, and Paul said, "That's all right." Instead of going straight home, Paul decided to take his loaf for a walk around the block. There was, he told himself, a perfectly rational explanation after all. Married sisters in Droitwich and unreliable cousins made much more sense in the cold light of morning than Gilbert and Sullivan bearing down on him like a brace of Nazgul. He'd probably also discover, if he could be bothered to investigate, that the through bus from Tesco's, Kentish Town to North Road, Highgate Village, was a regular scheduled route that ran every day at that time, and the bus had only been empty on that occasion because the couch lemmings of England were safely at home, glued to Scylla's blind date. As for the sudden prevalence of Gilbert and Sullivan, it was probably a centenary or something, which was why they'd suddenly cropped up all over the TV and the amateur stage. Nothing to see here, he told himself. It's all perfectly explainable and normal, except, that is, for the sword and the chunk of rock. An asteroid. A legacy from a distant, eccentric uncle. Maybe he should call the police after all, or at least switch on Crime Watch and see if there had been any break-ins down in the vaults of Buckingham Palace. To suppose, just because he couldn't think of an explanation, that the thing was inexplicable was tantamount to denying Einstein's theory because he hadn't figured it out for himself, on his fingers, from first principles. Paul spent the rest of the day watching old films on the box. Not the relaxing occupation it should have been, because the lack of space meant he had to crouch forward all the time, and the sword seemed somehow to be buggering up his signal. At some point in mid-afternoon he fell asleep, head lolling forward in his chair. When he woke up, it was late enough to go to bed. On Monday morning he woke up early, and there was an unusual spring in his step as he boiled the kettle and toasted a couple of slices of bread. Shaving was awkward, with the hilt of the sword trying to get in his ear as he leaned over the basin, but he managed it without bloodshed. He knew perfectly well why he felt so unusually chirpy. "See you on Monday," she'd said. For the first time in his working life, he couldn't wait to get to the office. He left home 10 minutes earlier than usual, and when he reached St Mary Axe at 8:45, he found that the street door was locked. Dilemma. If he knocked, would it earn him brownie points? Eager young clerk, anxious to make them a present of 15 minutes of his life, absolutely free? Or would he get a scowl and an unkind word for disturbing them, assuming, of course, that there was anybody inside to open the door? There were no signs of life. The blinds were drawn at the upper windows, and no electric light was seeping through. As he stood there, wrestling with the problem, he heard a scuffling noise inside. Then, very slowly, The letterbox flap was pushed outwards. Instinctively he bent down to see what was going on, and through the slit he distinctly saw one round red reptilian eye. Then the flap snapped shut, and the scuffling sound was repeated. Also, if he wasn't mistaken, he thought he heard a distant chuckling cackle, which put him in mind of the hyenas at the zoo. Mr. Tanner, he thought. But then Mr. Tanner himself appeared, walking rapidly up the street, fumbling in his pocket for keys. The sight of Paul standing outside the door seemed to take him by surprise. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Paul replied. "I'm early." Mr. Tanner grinned, very like a hyena. "Yes," he said. "Doors open at 9 sharp. It's 10 to." "Oh," said Paul. "I'm sorry." Mr. Tanner frowned, as though something was concerning him. "Well, you better come in," he said. He unlocked the door with 3 large old-fashioned keys and pushed past Paul like an elder brother bent on chocolate. "Wait there," he said, disappearing through the fire door as Paul stepped inside. "Confidential post," he added, but it sounded rather like an afterthought. The mail was still in the wire basket on the back of the door, and Mr. Tanner hadn't touched it. "All right," he said, reappearing through the fire door. "Come on in. I'll lock up behind you. You better go straight to your office." As he headed up the corridor, Paul heard the 3 locks grunch behind him. Odd, he thought. Not least the fact that Mr. Tanner had failed to make any witty remarks about pepperoni pizza. Not like him to disregard an opportunity like that, unless he was trying to lull Paul into a false sense of security. When he reached his office, it was in a mess. Not just the usual mess, on his side of the desk anyway. There were papers strewn all over the floor, and 2 of the filing cabinet drawers were open. Paul stood still for a moment, as if there'd been a burglary. He shouldn't touch anything. While he was trying to figure out what to do, the door flew open, and Mr. Wormtoter, Rick to friends, Paul hadn't seen hide nor hair of him since his first day, burst into the room. His hair was ruffled, and his claw pendant was hanging sideways from his jacket collar. "Ah," he said, looking at Paul rather sheepishly. "Hello, sir. You're in early." Paul nodded. "Traffic," he said automatically. "I see. Fine." Mr. Wormtoad looked at the desk and the filing cabinet, then at Paul, then back at the desk and the floor. "Bloody cleaners," he said, with a theatrical click of his tongue. "They always leave the place looking like a tip at weekends." He stooped down and grabbed a handful of papers. "Sorry about this," he said, slamming the filing cabinet door shut with his elbows. Oh, that's all right," Paul replied, wondering what was going on. "Here, let me." Mr. Wormtotter smiled anxiously and shuffled his feet. Paul got the feeling that he was standing on something Paul wasn't meant to see. "Actually," Mr. Wormtotter said, "would you do me a great favour? Nip across to the stationery store and get me 3 HB pencils. Thank you." On his way to the store, Paul met Mr. Suslovich, backing out of the conference room, dragging a large Hessian sack, and Mr. Whelms, who he hadn't seen since his interview, and who tried, unsuccessfully, to hide a dustpan and a ball of crumpled newspaper behind his back as Paul approached. He hurried past both of them with what he hoped was a respectful nod, got the pencils, filled in the book, and scuttled back to his office. The papers were all stacked neatly on the desk, and Mr. Wormtotter had gone. Paul scratched his head and decided not to think about it. Then he took his coat off and went to hang it on the hook behind the door. But it wasn't there anymore. Instead, there were 4 ragged holes where the screws had been torn out of the wood, and the unmistakable mark of a 4-pointed claw. "None of my business," he told himself. Then he bent down and looked under the desk, just to make sure there wasn't anything lurking there. Unfortunately, when he sat down, he found he was staring directly at the place where the coat hook had been, and the claw mark now was. The memory of the round red eye was making itself felt at the back of his mind. In fact, if the circumstances had been different, he'd have been out of the building like a rat up a drainpipe. Instead, he told himself to calm down, take it easy. After all, people who live in flats full of stone-encased cutlery are in no position to get uptight about other people's unexplained claw marks. He went across and traced the damaged woodwork with his fingertip. It felt rough and splintery, which went some way towards convincing him it was real. Are ostriches happy? He wondered. On the one hand, sticking your head in the sand kept you from seeing all sorts of things that could ruin your whole day. On the other hand, it had to be borne in mind that ostrich feather headgear was part of the traditional costume of many African countries, implying that the technique had its drawbacks. He sat down again, and the door opened. "Hello," she said, and immediately all thoughts of claw marks, beady red eyes, and skittering noises evaporated from his mind. She'd just smiled at him. Barely a 40-watt f5.6 at a 60th of a second smile, but as far as Paul was concerned, it was like being a kid again and seeing the sunrise for the first time ever. She'd never said hello to him before. "Hi," he replied awkwardly, as she slipped off her duffel coat and went to hang it on the hook. Oh, by the way," he added, but too late. She was frowning. "What's happened to the coat hook?" she said. "No idea." "It's gone. Looks like someone pulled it off." "And that's not all." He pointed at the claw mark and then asked sheepishly, "Can you see what I mean?" She nodded. "What on earth did that? Looks like fingernails or something." "You think so?" "Yes." "Wonderful, I mean," he added quickly. It's a bit of a relief. You see, I was afraid I was imagining it or something." "Why would you be doing that?" "I don't know." He hesitated. The urge to tell her was almost more than he could bear, but so was the fear of the look there'd be on her face if she didn't believe him. "Something, I don't know, sort of odd happened the other day, that's all." She turned her head towards him. "How sort of odd?" she asked. "Oh, well," he thought. Then he shut his eyes and said, "When I got back from that pub, where we had that drink—" "Yes?" "Well, when I got back," he repeated, "there was this thing stuck in my flat. The door was wide open, and someone had been in and dumped, well, a huge lump of rock, with a sword in it, big sharp thing. I cut my finger on it, look. And I tried pulling it out, because there was this writing on it, but it wouldn't budge, so I just chucked some old clothes over it so I wouldn't have to look at it, and it's still there this morning when I left." She looked at him in silence for 2, maybe as much as 2.5 seconds, enough time for stalactites to grow from the ceiling down to the floor. "You too, huh?" she said. He nodded. "Oh, joy," he thought. "She believed me. She doesn't think I'm... what did you say?" "You got one too," she replied, sitting down and rubbing her nose with her knuckle. "Two?" "That's right. One got delivered at our house late Saturday evening, just before I got home. As it happens, yesterday was my dad's birthday, so I assumed it was a present for him. He got the delivery men to lug it through onto the patio, between the potted ferns and the water feature. He's absolutely thrilled with it, as a matter of fact." "Oh," said Paul. "Did yours have writing on it?" She nodded. And yes," she added, "I tried, and when nobody was looking." "Any luck?" "No." "Same here. Hardly surprising, of course. According to my mum, my great-great-grandfather was mayor of Ramsgate some time before the First World War. But that's as close as our family's ever been to royalty. Besides, I don't think I'd want the job anyway, launching ships and being shown round factories all day." She nodded. "It'd been really embarrassing if I'd managed to pull the stupid thing out," she said. "I don't approve of the monarchy. My mum wouldn't have been pleased, though. She's really into the royals. She's got books and commemorative china and everything." "Lucky escape, then. Have you got any idea what it's all about?" She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "Still, it's nice to hear you got one too. I thought I must be going mad." Paul thought for a moment. "Who delivered it?" he asked. "Did your father say?" She shook her head. "I didn't like to ask," she said, "because of him thinking it was for his birthday, and all I'd got him was a tie, so it was quite handy, really." She looked back at the door. "Too far up the door for a dog," she said, "unless it's a really big one. How big do Great Danes get?" "Not that big," Paul replied. "I hope," he added. Then he told her about Mr. Wormtoter and Mr. Susseledge and the sack and Mr. Wells. "Oh, and I got here early," he added, "and Tanner showed up while I was standing outside the door. It was still locked," he explained, "and he didn't seem pleased to see me at all. Made me wait in reception while he went off somewhere." She shrugged. "Maybe he just ate a bad rissole," she said. "But the other stuff, what do you think was in that sack?" "No idea, and I didn't hang around to look, you know," he added. I'd really like to find out exactly what they do around here." "You and me both," she said. "You aren't tempted to get out then? Resign, I mean." "What, miss all the fun of finding out the mysterious secret?" "Yes." Paul nodded. "You bet. I don't like all this weird stuff. On the other hand, I need the job." "Same here. If I went home and told them I jacked it in, they'd go mad. You know, scenes and melodrama. Give me the weirdness any day." Quietly, Paul blessed the thin girl's parents for their attitude, because if she threw in her job, that'd be that. He'd probably never see her again. Mysterious swords and things with claws didn't exactly appeal to him as integral parts of the working environment, but he was damned if he was going to let them come between him and a girl who'd actually smiled at him. Twice. "Looks like we're stuck here then," he said cheerfully. "Oh well, there's probably a perfectly simple explanation," he added. "Really? Such as?" He shrugged. "Well, just because I can't figure it out doesn't mean it's not blindingly obvious." "I can't figure it out either." "Well," he conceded, "maybe it's not that simple, but there's got to be an explanation. We'll probably laugh ourselves silly when we hear what it is." Clearly, she didn't think so. "Well," she said, "I suppose we better get on with some work." "I guess," Paul replied. "Talking of which, it may just be my imagination, but I think we're getting close to the end of this. I mean, when was the last time Julie showed up with a new batch of this garbage?" She thought for a moment. "Just after Friday lunchtime." "That's right. When we started, it was coming in about hourly intervals. It's definitely slowing up." "You could be right." She looked away for a moment. "Look," she said, "I know I'm hopelessly slow at this. If you could do some of my pile." "Sure," Paul said. He was afraid he'd sounded too eager. If you don't mind, I mean, after all, it's a really stupid, boring job. The sooner we get it finished, the sooner they'll give us something else that's not quite so boring." "Or something worse." He shook his head. "Define worse." "You're right. Here," she went on, shoving her snowdrift of spreadsheets across the desk at him. "You do this lot, all right?" He nodded. "Thank you." "What for?" "Oh, well," he couldn't say. "Thanks for not being quite so snotty and horrible. You've no idea how much it means to me." Well, it helps pass the time," he said lamely. By now, he could shuffle and sort the spreadsheets without having to apply his mind at all. Today, that was something of a mixed blessing. Somehow, he had the idea that if he thought too hard about her apparent change of attitude and its implications, it would ruin everything. He wanted to white noise the thoughts out of his mind, but the spreadsheets didn't cut it anymore. He finished his pile almost without noticing, and when he looked up, she'd finished too. In fact, she was grinning. "Beat you," she said. "You cheated." "Did not." "Did." Another of those moments was starting to form. But then the door opened, and Julie came in. She wasn't carrying any bales of computer paper, Paul noticed, as he cursed her abominable timing. "You finished that lot, then?" she said, with no apparent surprise. "Right. Mr. Tanner's got another job he wants you to do for him." Oh, right, Paul said, and he was thinking, she knew we'd finished. How did she know that? "What is it?" "Oh, nothing very exciting," Julie sighed, sweeping up the sorted piles. "I'll take these up to Mr. Tanner, and then I'll bring it down for you." "Right," Paul said. "Can I give you a hand?" "I can manage, thanks," Julie said, with a hint of disapproval. "I'll be back in 2 ticks." A tick turned out to be 3 minutes long. When she came back, she had 2 large green pocket files, which she placed on the desk and opened. "Right," she said. "This is a whole lot of aerial photographs of some place or other. He wants you to look at them, and if you see anywhere it looks like it might be a bauxite deposit, you're to draw a ring round it in green marker pen. All right." "A what?" the girl asked. "Bauxite deposit. Now there's no rush. Just make sure you do a nice, thorough job." "But hang on," Paul said. "I'm sorry, but I haven't got the faintest idea what a bauxite deposit looks like. In fact, I don't even know what bauxite is." Julie sighed. "Nor me," she said, and left the room. Paul and the girl looked at each other for a moment or so. "Bauxite," she said. Paul nodded. "What the hell is bauxite?" he said. "Actually," the girl answered, "I know about bauxite. It's a naturally occurring mineral mostly used as feed for the manufacture of alumina via a wet chemical caustic leach method commonly known as the Bayer process. Mostly it comes from Australia, although other significant producers include Papua New Guinea and Jamaica. We did a school project," she explained. "When I was 12. I know a lot of stuff like that," she added, with a hint of sadness. "Oh," Paul said. "Right, well, we might as well take a look at these pictures. Australia, did you say?" She nodded. "And Papua New Guinea and Jamaica." "Fine, so we can forget about any bird's eye views of Southampton for a start." He opened the file and pulled out a sheaf of large black and white prints. They didn't even look particularly like landscapes. "You know," he went on, "this is a bit more like it. Bauxite, I mean, it's like something concrete." "No, it's not," the girl told him. "Concrete is an artificial amalgam of sand and cement widely used in the construction of..." "Concrete," Paul said, "as opposed to nebulous and wishy-washy. What I mean is mineral deposits and stuff. That sounds like a proper business. You know, industry, high finance, capitalism." "You mean boring?" Paul nodded. "Boring and non-weird. I mean, bauxite, it's a whole different kettle of fish from claw marks and swords in stones, isn't it?" She wiped her nose on her cuff and frowned. "Could be," she said. "Bound to be, unless, of course, the swords are stuck into a bauxite nuggets," he added. "It could be a smuggling thing, you know, getting them past customs disguised as tacky tourist souvenirs." She was looking underwhelmed. "You don't think so?" "No. It's a bit unlikely, I grant you, but still." "Let's look at the pictures, shall we?" Not only did the pictures look quite unlike anything, let alone bits of countryside, they were all practically identical. With a certain degree of imagination, you could just about talk yourself into believing they might represent tracts of featureless desert. "I can't believe there's anywhere on Earth that looks like this," the girl said. "That's assuming it is," Paul said. "On Earth, I mean. Could be satellite snaps of the moon or some asteroid." She shrugged. "Or someone forgot to take the lens cap off. Anyway, I can't see how we're supposed to tell what's under all that." "Agreed. When you did your project, you didn't happen to have anything in it about what the stuff actually looks like, did you?" "No." "Oh." He chose a print at random and stared at it for a moment or so. "Completely hopeless," he said. "It's just..." We could look it up on the internet," the girl interrupted. "There's bound to be something. Probably pictures of lumps of bauxite. At least we'd know what the colour is. That'd be something." "Good idea," Paul said enthusiastically. "Hang on, though. You haven't got a computer?" "No, but there's one in the back of reception that nobody ever uses. You know, on the desk next to the table where they frank the letters. I'll nip down there and see what I can find out, shall I?" "All right. I better stay here in case Julie comes back. Wouldn't look too good if she found the place empty." "Fine. If she asks where I've got to, say I've gone for a pee or something." She stopped, her hand on the door handle. "Well, anyway," she said, "this is better than sorting those stupid bloody printouts." Left alone with nothing to do, Paul picked out a couple of prints and stared at them for a while. Staring at them for very long made his head ache, and he'd just made up his mind not to bother any more and tell Julie when she came by next that he'd scanned the lot, sorry no bauxite anywhere, when he felt an odd prickling sensation in his finger where it was resting on the surface of the photograph. The nearest thing to it that he'd felt before was the uncomfortable burning itch you get in a patch of skin you scalded an hour or so earlier. He took his hand away and the tingling stopped immediately. At first he assumed it was an allergic reaction to the chemicals that had been used to develop the picture. But that couldn't be right, or it wouldn't have stopped so promptly when he took his hand away. Feeling extremely foolish, he stretched out his finger and somewhat unwillingly touched the photo again. Nothing. Nor tingle, nor anything except the smooth, slightly soapy texture of the print. Coincidence, he thought. Just an itchy finger, and I happened to be touching the picture at the time. Then he caught sight of the very faint smear his fingertip had left on the surface the first time. A vague memory drifted into his mind of something he'd seen in a TV documentary years ago. Something to do with hazel twigs and eccentric old men running around in fields. He touched the fingerprint and the tingling came back. He took his finger away. The tingling stopped. Touch, tingle, away, stop. He tried prodding other parts of the photo, but there was no reaction. It was that one place and no other, but the effect was exactly the same each time. Surely not, he thought, but he was sure he wasn't imagining the prickly feeling. He tried a couple of different pictures, but none of them affected him at all. Crazy! With a shrug, he opened the desk drawer and scrabbled about until he found a green marker pen. He'd already considered drawing a few green rings at random, just to show willing, and if he was going to do that, well, the fingerprint was as good a place as any. He uncapped the pen and drew a green circle around the smudge. Vaguely, he recalled that the nutty old men with hazel twigs called it dowsing or scrying, and the TV show had reckoned there was something to it, so it wasn't that far-fetched. Of course, even if what he was doing really was dowsing or scrying, there was absolutely no reason to suppose that what he'd located was bauxite. It could just as easily be water, or a buried electricity cable, or a rusty old sardine can, like the ones he'd seen metal detector freaks fishing out of muddy riverbanks in the grey light of sunset. He put the picture to one side and tried a few others, tracing his fingertip over the surface in what he hoped was a methodical grid pattern. He was doing this, and not so much as a twinge or a single pin or needle, when the thin girl came back in. "What are you doing?" she said. He thought about telling her, and decided not to. With so much residual loopiness on every side, he didn't really want to introduce any more of his own making, just in case she decided she'd had enough and ran screaming from the building. "Oh, nothing," he said. "Just wiping off a bit of dust. How'd you get on with the computer?" She sat down. "No luck," she said. "Actually, their computers are pretty weird. I mean, they aren't Windows or anything like that, or even Unix or Mac. It's some other system I've never seen before. There isn't even a mouse. To be honest," she went on, "I haven't a clue how it works. I sat there for ages trying to figure it out, but hitting the keys didn't seem to do anything. I thought it had frozen or something, but then I was sitting there staring at the screen, wondering what to do, and suddenly these menus dropped down, with all the open files and launch browser things on them, and, well, this is going to sound a bit strange, but as soon as I looked at something and thought, I wonder what that one does, there it was on the screen, just like—" She stopped abruptly, and Paul guessed she'd been about to use the M word, but shied away from it at the last moment. "Just like that," she said. "Anyhow, once I stopped trying to figure out how it worked and simply got on with it, I didn't have any trouble at all." This did mean a great deal to Paul, who firmly believed that all computers work by magic, and not the sort of magic that was safe to have around the house at that. For all he knew, the system she'd just described was a vintage trilby as far as Silicon Valley was concerned. "So, did you get on the net?" he asked. She shook her head. "I was just about to when Susie, the office junior, came up behind me and said was I going to be long because she needed to use the computer. So I left her to it and came back here. Waste of time and effort, really," she added. "Though for what it's worth, someone in this place is a Tolkien geek, because I opened up one file by accident and it was all in those funny curly made-up letters the sad people use for writing Elvish. You know, the letters that look like little fronds of broccoli. There were pages of the stuff." "Oh," Paul said. "You sure that's what it was? I mean, it wasn't Russian or something?" "I know what Russian looks like," she replied with a frown. "Okay," Paul said. "Well, I'm sure you're right. I mean, the people who are into all that stuff do some really weird things, like translating the Bible into Klingon, and it's not like this outfit is staffed entirely by unimpeachably sane people. She nodded. Why have you drawn a little green circle on this photo? She asked. What? Oh, that one, he shrugged. I thought I'd better do one or two, just to prove we've actually looked at the stupid things. Otherwise, I might think we've just shoved them from one side of the desk to the other without bothering. She shrugged. Fair enough, she said. After all, it can't do any harm to humour them. Actually, I was wondering if this is just something they've dreamed up to try and get rid of us. First they try and freak us out with the claw marks, and now they've given us this absolutely ludicrous job to do. Might even explain the swords, come to think of it. Sure, Paul agreed. Only, why would they want to do that? They've only just hired us. That's right, she replied. And they've realised they've hired a couple of totally unsuitable people, and they're trying to make us quit. Probably if they fired us out of hand, they'd have to pay us compensation or redundancy or something. But if we just leave of our own accord, it won't cost them any money. That came as close to making sense as anything Paul had heard since the first time he passed through the front door. Bastards, he said, trying to cheat us like that, and playing games with our heads into the bargain. The thin girl nodded cynically. Employers, she said. Exactly the sort of thing you'd expect them to do. Well, they can forget that. If they're trying to get rid of me, I'm definitely staying. Great, Paul said. I mean, yes, me too. Can't let them shove us around like that. He leaned back in his chair, as though this constituted an act of defiance. Right, he said. So what do we do now? Well, definitely not look at their stupid photos, she replied. Of all the bloody nerve, thinking we're idiotic enough to be fooled by something like that. I agree, Paul said. So what do we do instead? The thin girl looked around the room. I don't know, she said. It's going to get pretty boring just sitting here. Paul thought for a moment. We could play battleships, he said. She looked at him as though he'd suggested a spot of bear baiting. Battleships? He nodded. It's a game, he said. All you need is 2 bits of paper and 2 pencils. He explained the rules. She didn't seem keen. Sounds a bit too macho-militaristic to me, she said, blowing up ships and stuff. I happen to think war is barbaric and wrong. That seemed to rule out battleships, and Hangman probably wouldn't go down too well either. Tell you what, Paul suggested, how about find the bauxite? She looked at him. What? It's like battleships, he said. Only, well, we pretend we're 2 third-world relief agencies. We've got to locate valuable mineral resources in an undeveloped third-world country before the rich multinational mining cartels get their hands on them and start exploiting them in an ecologically disastrous fashion. Here. He went back to the desk drawer and found a pack of tracing paper he'd noticed earlier. He took out 2 sheets and quickly drew a grid pattern on both of them with a ruler. We put the grid over one of these dumb photographs each, and you've got to call out where you think my bauxite mines are, and so on. That's silly. Yes. She hesitated for a long time, and then, quite suddenly, she smiled. All right, she said, and if Julie or anybody comes in, it'll look like we're working, and they won't have an excuse to fire us. Yes, that sounds like it might be fun. She frowned slightly, and then grabbed a photograph from the folder. I'll start, she said. They marked up their grids in pencil, and the thin girl called out the first set of coordinates. Paul checked them by running his finger down the page, and suddenly there it was again, that odd tingling sensation. He pulled his hand away sharply. Well, she said eagerly. Sure enough, the square she'd called out was one of the ones he'd marked. Spot on, he said. You're good at this. She nodded. You'll go, she said. Paul drew a blank, and then the girl chose another square. Once again, Paul ran his fingertip down the page. Once again, as soon as he touched the square she'd nominated, it was like a mild electric shock. 2 in a row, he said. You are good at this. Don't sound so surprised, she replied huffily. You can't expect to win at everything just because you're a man. Next turn he missed again, and she didn't. Yet another burning sensation. Paul flexed his fingers nervously, but didn't say anything. 3 turns later the game was over. She'd guessed all his squares without missing once, and he hadn't guessed any of hers. Each time, too, he'd felt the slight shock running up his fingernail out of the photograph. "Here," she demanded, "let me see your grid. If you've been letting me win out of some bloody stupid notion of chivalry." He handed it over without a word. She looked at it, and her eyes gleamed. Clearly she enjoyed winning. "Let's have another game," she said. "I like this." So they played another game, and another one after that, each time with exactly the same results. After a fourth game, same outcome, they looked at each other. "That's so weird," she said. He hesitated for a moment, and then he told her about the electric shock thing. At first she looked like she hadn't believed him, and then she frowned. "The stupid thing is," she said, "when I'm choosing squares, it's like I just know. Sometimes I don't even bother to look. It's like I hear the grid number in my head and repeat it." A curious look crept onto Paul's face. "And before you ask," she added, "no, I don't do the lottery or bet on horse races." "Maybe you should." She shook her head. "I've never won on anything like that in my life," she said. "And I can't bend spoons either, if that's what you're thinking." She stopped and frowned. "How about you?" "Nothing doing on either score," Paul said. "Here, do you think there really might be bauxite under these grid squares?" She didn't answer, but she handed him the green marker pen. "Might as well," she said. "After all, they're paying us." "Yes, but I thought it was all just a scheme." He shrugged and reached for the print he'd just been using and the tracing paper grid. By the time he'd finished drawing rings on the pictures, it was about 1 o'clock. Lunch. That reminded him. He had something very difficult, dangerous and momentous to do right now. But in all the excitement it slipped his mind. "You doing anything for lunch?" he asked, as casually as he could, namely, not very. "I've got a cheese sandwich and a bottle of tap water. Why?" "Well," he said, "to be honest with you, I feel like I need a drink." Which he did, but not because of the electric shocks or the phantom bauxite. "You coming?" She frowned. "I don't drink at lunchtime," she said. "Neither do I, generally speaking," he replied, not mentioning why, "but let's get out of here, anyway." There was a moment. Paul could almost hear the coin rattling as it spun round on its rim. "All right," she said. Choking back the urge to burst out singing "The Sun Has Got His Hat On," Paul stood up. "We'd better go now," he said, "before they lock the door." "All right." So they went to the little Italian sandwich bar on a corner of the next street down the block. As they stood in line at the counter, it occurred to Paul that if he didn't want to have to walk home to Kentish Town that night, the most he could afford was a sugar lump, whereupon the thin girl looked at him and said, "My treat." Are you... "Sure, yes. What do you want?" Paul opted for a ham roll and a coffee. The thin girl ordered the same, minus the ham roll. They sat perched on bar stools in a corner. As far as Paul was concerned, it was rather more unreal than the electric shocks, or the claw mark, or even the sword in the stone. Here he was, he realised, alone in a food establishment with a girl. Not just that, but the girl was the one he most wanted to be with. Talk about coincidences. Bizarre round eyes peering at him through letterbox he could more or less take in his stride. But this was unnerving. "Well," he said. "Well, what?" She had a spot of cappuccino foam on the tip of her nose. Cartier and Fabergé never designed such an exquisite ornament. He couldn't help thinking that this girl seemed to have an uncanny knack of reading his thoughts, and yet here she was. "I don't know," he said. "It's all a bit strange, isn't it?" She waggled her eyebrows very slightly. Suddenly Paul wished he was in Australia or somewhere equally far away. "By the way," she said abruptly, "I'm Sophie. It's a horrible name and I hate it." "I'm Paul," Paul replied. "Pleased to meet you." She smiled. Just a crack, but enough for a sliver of light to get through. "I don't like Paul much either," he went on. "My dad says Paul was the name of the doctor who delivered me. Mum's under the impression she named me after Paul McCartney. I've always reckoned Paul must be the word for idiot in some language that everybody else knows, except me." "It's an all right sort of name," she said equably, "in a nothingish sort of way." Paul shrugged. "I'd have preferred John," he said. Or George, or probably even Ringo. What about you?
Oh, some great aunt, I think, she replied. There was another girl called Sophie in my class at primary school. Couldn't stand her.
Paul nodded. I was the only Paul in my class, he said. Loads of Tonys and Andys and Chris's, and even had a couple of Julians.
It was all Carolines and Emmas where I was. A couple of Pauls. Can't remember much about them.
We had one poor kid called Galadriel, Paul remembered. That'd be a horrible thing to do to anybody, let alone your own flesh and blood. The thin girl, no, he corrected himself, Sophie, frowned slightly. Clearly she hadn't got the reference, but wasn't about to admit it by asking. That seemed to be about as far as names were going to get them. So, Paul said, apart from the weirdness, what do you think of it so far?
Very boring, she said. I mean, all those stupid print-out things, and I was rubbish at doing them, which made it worse, of course.
Paul didn't comment on that. I take it this isn't exactly your idea of a rich, fulfilling career?
No.
What is? She scowled.
I don't know, she said. Truth is, I don't really want to do anything much. Oh, I want to do something, I just don't know what yet. Obviously, she went on, money doesn't matter, or any of that sort of rubbish, and obviously I want to do something that helps make the world a better place. I thought about social work or becoming a doctor so I could go to Africa, or pottery or joining a group of travellers, something like that, you know, a statement. But when I got right down to it, there didn't seem to be any point. Fact is, I'm not really very good at anything, and I can't stand doing things I'm bad at. And that only left, well, rubbish sort of jobs. And my mum and dad still think I'm going to get married and have kids, so obviously they're no help, which is how I ended up here, I suppose.
Paul grinned. Sounds like you're a bit more organised than me, even so. You see, when I was a kid, it was nice and simple. There was playtime, and then there was other stuff, and you had to eat up all the other stuff before you could have any pudding, if you see what I mean. And that's basically how I've carried on ever since. The only difference is, when I was a kid, I always knew I wanted to play next. There was always some game or some toy or whatever. These days, I sit at home in the evenings watching the garbage on the telly. Very boring, but at least it's not work. She looked at him.
So work's always got to be horrible and nasty then?
Oh, not necessarily, he replied. Obviously, some people like it. Actually, of the people I was at school with, I can think of 2 of them who really like what they're doing, you know. They live for their jobs, like they're seamlessly merged into what they do, to the point where it sort of defines who they are.
That doesn't sound so bad,
Sophie objected. Not in theory, Paul said, but of those 2, one of them's an estate agent and the other one works at an abattoir. Shortly after that, to Paul's great surprise, it was 3 minutes to 2 and high time they were getting back to the office. They had to walk quickly, and it had come on to rain while they'd been in the cafe. Sophie, he noticed, was capable of moving very fast without showing any signs of it. He found it hard to keep up with her simply by walking along, but breaking into a trot would have made him look ridiculous. They reached the door just as it swung open. The receptionist, Paul hadn't seen her before, he'd have remembered if he had, smiled at them as they shot past her.
Have you noticed, Sophie muttered, as they climbed the stairs, how there's always someone different on reception?
Paul nodded. But they always say hello like they know who I am, he said. On the landing, they ran into Mr. Suslovich. He looked tired and harassed, though he beamed at them both and asked them how they were getting on. Paul replied, "Oh, fine," or something like that. Mr. Suslovich asked if either of them had seen the long stapler, but they said they hadn't. He shrugged, grinned, and disappeared into the photocopier room. Julie was waiting for them when they reached their office. She was standing by the desk, looking at the green rings Paul had drawn on the photographs.
"You've been busy," she said.
Paul wasn't sure what to make of that. "Is that how they wanted it done?" he asked. Julie nodded.
"Looks all right as far as I can see," she said. "But then it's not up to me. Anyhow, here's another batch there for you to look at. And when you've done that, Mr. Tanner would like to see you in his room."
When she'd gone, Paul pulled a face. "Wonderful," he said.
"You mustn't let him get to you,"
Sophie replied briskly.
"Remember the results."
Paul shook his head. "It's all very well saying rissoles," he said, "but that bloke gives me the horrors. He reminds me of something."
She nodded. "He's a spitting image of the goblin on page 7 of my fairy tale book," she said. "The one who ate naughty children. I used to have nightmares."
"Makes you wonder what was in the rissoles," Paul said gloomily. They divided the photos between them and went over them in silence, taking the job seriously. But Paul didn't get any more electric shocks, and Sophie simply stared blankly at each print in turn before adding it to the pile. The green marker pen stayed where it was in the middle of the desk.
"Well," Sophie said when they'd done the last one, "suppose you'd better go."
Paul stood up and opened the door, and as he did so, he realised something was different. There were quotes behind it, his and hers.
How did that?
Sophie began to say. Paul pushed the quotes aside, and there under them was a shiny, new brass coat hook. Also, he couldn't help noticing that, although there wasn't any wet paint or sign of any other repair activity, the claw mark had completely disappeared.